Psychic girl claims she can make broke millionaire rich again. Then 2 days later, comment, giving my story a score from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The shout sliced through the muggy afternoon air in the historic town like a knife, echoing through the cobblestone streets at precisely 3 p.m. 52-year-old millionaire developer who had amassed his fortune through investments in the stock market, almost dropped his coffee mug as he moved away from the window of his luxury apartment. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the colonial house across the street, a faded yellow 2-story building with peeling blue window frames that contrasted sharply with the sleek modern building where he lived. "Must be a kid throwing a tantrum," he muttered to himself, adjusting his tie before returning to work. As the owner of the largest construction company in the region, he was used to solving complex problems, but he preferred to stay away from other people's dramas, especially after living alone for 5 years. Ever since he lost his wife on a rainy night, he preferred not to remember. His net worth in dollars seemed endless, but all that wealth couldn't fill the void he carried in his chest. Across the street, inside the colonial house, the 4-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the kitchen, her years insufficient to understand why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman firmly held a metal spoon she had heated on the wood-burning stove, her eyes red from alcohol, fixed on the girl who trembled before her. "You're a plague on this house," hissed the intoxicated aunt, her voice slurred from the booze she had been consuming since noon at the corner bar. "Because of you, my sister is gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her thin arms. The child bit her lip to avoid screaming louder. She had learned that screams only angered her aunt more, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice, singing that lullaby before bed. It was all that was left of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful moments. "Stop whimpering," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon back in the cupboard as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you smudge the walls again with that filthy charcoal, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up under the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's song softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The millionaire stopped reviewing contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it while cooking, a popular tune about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the colonial house. One of the windows at the back was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that struck a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. His investments and financial assets had given him material comfort, but they couldn't silence that growing unease. Next door to the colonial house, the 61-year-old retired teacher was watering her begonias when she heard the girl singing. Unlike the businessman, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years of teaching, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress, and that voice carried a pain that made her heart ache. "That's strange," she thought, watching the windows of the neighboring house. The family had always been troubled, but ever since the woman had taken custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the atmosphere of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children in the historic town. The teacher dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had properly spoken to the woman, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little orphan better. The millionaire remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories that he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of a former employee who had abruptly resigned 5 years ago, a few months before his wife's accident. The employee was a kind woman, always humming while organizing the construction company's files. Then, suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought about her again, until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to suffer in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains surrounding the town when the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers clutched the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the bird she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, the millionaire closed the curtains and tried to return to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something that he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. His hard-earned fortune seemed insignificant in the face of that haunting voice. Night fell over the historic town, but the echo of that children's song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running away from his responsibilities, and a retired teacher who had never been able to ignore the suffering of a child. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical hustle and bustle of the historic town awakening for another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her in peace, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the colonial house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The intoxicated aunt opened the door with a swollen face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning," said the teacher with her gentlest smile. "I've come to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've had a proper chat." The woman hesitated, running her hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, teacher, it's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The teacher took a step forward, forcing the woman to step back. "And I would very much like to meet your niece. I hear she's a lovely girl." The aunt's face hardened for a moment before forcing a sickly smile. "The girl is sick. High fever. Best not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher perked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Perhaps I can help," the educator insisted. "I have experience with sick children. Raised 3 myself, you know how it is." "No need, no," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just a cold. It will pass soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol emanating from her even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades of dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the millionaire watched the scene from his window while eating breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confused dreams where the voice of a child mingled with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the colonial house, a strange curiosity washed over him. Inside the colonial house, the aunt slammed the door shut and headed to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouching behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach for a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" the woman growled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty, Aunt," the girl mumbled, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the backyard. And since you like making so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single mango tree. There she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the wood-burning stove. It was always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. Hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the girl in the yard under the strong midday sun. The child began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to softly sing her mother's song, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached the millionaire's ears again. This time he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar in that voice, in that specific song. He took out his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. His former employee used to hum that same song while working. The kind woman who had been an exemplary employee until she disappeared abruptly. The employee who always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl named... The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the kind woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How had he not made this connection before? The businessman put away his cell phone and began to pace back and forth in his luxurious apartment. He vaguely remembered the employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems in the company, that he hadn't paid enough attention. Now, 5 years later, the employee's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt he carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including regret for not helping when she clearly needed it. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, punctually, the screams started again. This time, the millionaire did not move away from the window. He watched with growing horror as through the kitchen window of the colonial house he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He took out his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently in the direction of a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time he couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. His financial assets and all his accumulated wealth seemed insignificant in the face of that cruel reality. The question now was, what would he do with this information? The retired teacher had finally said goodbye to her neighbor, but not before casting an investigative look at the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. That night, the girl slept on the floor of the backyard, where her aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the mango tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her away from that place of pain. Across the street, the millionaire couldn't sleep. tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's departure. All his money, all his possessions, all his wealth built over the years were useless if he didn't have the courage to use his resources to help an innocent child suffering a few feet from his window. 3 days had passed since the millionaire discovered the child's identity, and guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During those days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 in the afternoon, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the retired teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering a few feet from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in the neighboring colonial house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting another direct visit to the intoxicated aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 a.m., she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the location from which she had the best view of the backyard of the colonial house. What she saw horrified her. The girl was sitting under the mango tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing in the dirt with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "My God," whispered the educator, her hands trembling as she held the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined. Much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," said the girl in her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, sweetheart," replied the teacher, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you okay?" The girl glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine. I'm just drawing birdies." "That's nice. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," the child replied, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the educator's heart. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Girl, where are you?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the teacher needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the educator with an expression that screamed for help. The teacher remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend that she didn't know what was happening. Across the street, the millionaire had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he was able to see the yard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt a genuine fury burning in his chest. His former employee had trusted him in some way, even if indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time. She had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. At 11 a.m., the teacher made a courageous decision. She put on her best business attire, took a tray of homemade cookies that she had prepared as a pretext, and headed again to the colonial house. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's insistence. "Teacher, I already told you it's not a good time." "Honey, I brought some cookies that I made yesterday," interrupted the educator firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little one better. As long-time neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before the woman could protest, the teacher had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom experience had given her. The interior of the colonial house was dark and smelled of mold mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the living room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," lied the aunt, blocking the way to the back of the house. "That's a shame." "Maybe another time then," said the teacher. But her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the stove, and mainly small charcoal drawings on the walls that clearly had been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. The teacher and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "It must be the neighbor's cat," said the woman quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The educator smiled and nodded, but had decided she had already seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always next door if you need anything at all." The teacher's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the neighbor left, the aunt locked the door forcefully and headed to the kitchen, where she found the girl curled up behind the wood-burning stove, trying to hide. The child had cried when she heard the teacher's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," accused the aunt, her eyes already shining with familiar fury. "No, aunt, I didn't make noise," protested the girl, but her small voice sounded weak, even to her. The woman picked up the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. The girl recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to get attention, don't you?" hissed the aunt as the spoon heated up. "You want the neighbors to come here asking questions? You think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, the millionaire had positioned his cell phone on the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated employee who always spoke of her daughter with love. This child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. All his capital accumulated over the years would be useless if he didn't have the courage to use it to protect an innocent. As the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the businessman made a call that he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend. "Robert, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching from the window as the child's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it may be a matter of life or suffering." The lawyer, surprised by the friend's urgent tone, immediately agreed to meet with him the next day. There was something in the millionaire's voice that indicated that this time he was serious about getting out of his emotional paralysis. That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room sofa, the girl managed to quietly sneak out into the backyard. Her new burns burned, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the mango tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's song softly. What she didn't know was that for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering, and that, in the coming days, her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. The teacher had already decided that she would seek the appropriate authorities, and the millionaire had finally found the courage to turn his wealth into concrete action to protect an innocent child. The lawyer arrived at the millionaire's apartment on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been colleagues at university almost 3 decades ago, and Robert knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," said Robert, sitting in the apartment's spacious living room. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." The millionaire poured coffee and stood next to the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being mistreated by the aunt who takes care of her." "Mistreated how?" asked Robert, taking a notepad out of his briefcase. "Burns, daily screams, neglect." The businessman paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, Robert. Evidence of what's happening." Robert was silent for a moment, processing the information. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately." "I know," replied the millionaire, running his hands over his face. "But there's something more. The employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before my wife's accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible," completed Robert, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded. "If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have had to leave her daughter with this woman." At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and Robert could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "Does this happen every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 in the afternoon religiously." "But sometimes also at other times," replied the millionaire, taking his cell phone. "Do you want to see the recordings?" Robert watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a lawyer specializing in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something about the systematization of that violence disturbed him deeply. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings right now. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the district attorney's office. This child needs to be removed from that house immediately." While the two men planned the intervention, across the street, the girl was living another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the child had made on the kitchen wall during the early hours. "How many times do I have to tell you not to smudge the walls?" shouted the woman, holding the girl by the arm hard enough to leave marks. "You are a plague, a curse on this house." The child tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone. But the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. "You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you," continued the aunt, pushing the girl down the hallway. "And if I hear even a noise, you'll know a punishment you've never experienced before." The retired teacher had spent the whole night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard, about the marks she had seen on the child's arms, about the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. At that moment, she also made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying yet another direct approach, the educator headed to downtown, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew the caseworker in charge well, a former student of hers, who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. "Anna, I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," said the teacher, entering the office without ceremony. The caseworker looked up from the papers she was reviewing. "Teacher, it's good to see you. What brings you here today?" "A child in danger, my neighbor. I'm sure she's being mistreated." The former student straightened up in her chair, her expression immediately becoming serious. During her 5 years as a caseworker, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious, and her former teacher was not the type of person who would make reckless accusations. "Tell me everything," said Anna, picking up a complaint form. While the teacher reported her observations across town, Robert was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. The prosecutor listened attentively as the lawyer presented the evidence collected by the millionaire. "This is compelling evidence," said the prosecutor, examining the videos on Robert's cell phone. I will order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will this take?" asked Robert, worried. "With this evidence, we can act today," replied the prosecutor. "I will contact Child Protective Services now." By a coincidence that would change the girl's destiny, two simultaneous complaints arrived at Child Protective Services on the same morning. Anna was finishing writing down the teacher's account when her phone rang. "Child Protective Services, Anna speaking." "Anna, this is the prosecutor. I need you to make an urgent intervention in a house on Cobblestone Street. We have evidence of serious child abuse." Anna paused, her pen suspended over the paper. "Is it number 127 by any chance? Yellow Colonial House?" "Exactly. How did you know?" "I just received a complaint about the same house," replied Anna, looking at the teacher with surprise. "Two independent sources. This confirms the severity of the situation." At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being put together. Anna, accompanied by 2 social workers and a court officer, was heading to the Colonial House. The teacher had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The millionaire watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. Robert was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. "You did the right thing," said Robert, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," replied the businessman, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the Colonial House. At the house, the aunt had left to buy alcohol at the corner bar, leaving the girl locked in the stuffy room. The child kept singing softly, unaware that her life was about to change in a radical way. When Anna knocked on the door of the Colonial House and received no response, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in every room. It was the teacher who first heard the faint voice coming from the room in the back. "Someone's here," she said, guiding the team down the hall. When they opened the bedroom door and found the girl huddled in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child looked up with big, frightened eyes, not understanding who these people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, sweetheart," said Anna, crouching down to be at the child's level. "My name is Anna. We're here to help you." The girl looked at the teacher, recognizing the kind lady who had talked to her in the yard. A flash of hope shone in her eyes, but was quickly replaced by fear. "Aunt's going to be mad," she whispered. "You don't have to worry about that now," said the teacher, reaching out to the girl. "We're going to get you out of here, okay?" Across the street, the millionaire had finally found a purpose for all his accumulated wealth. In the months that followed, he would use his resources not only to ensure that the girl had proper medical care, but also to create a real home for her. The teacher would become her legal guardian, and together they would give the child what she had always deserved: love, security, and the chance to fly freely like the birds she loved to draw so much. Thus, after months of silent suffering, the girl was finally removed from the house where she had known only pain and fear, beginning a journey that would lead her back to the light she had lost. And a wealthy man discovered that true fortune was not in his investments or assets, but in the ability to turn money into hope for those who needed it most.